From Software's Souls-like formula is a winning one, and so it's really no surprise that so many other developers have taken inspiration from the studio's games. The latest game to take a stab at the Souls-like genre is the First Berserker Khazan, a hardcore action RPG set in the Dungeon Fighter Online universe. The First Berserker Khazan has stood out from the mountain of other Souls-like games thanks to its anime-inspired art style, but rest assured it's a familiar Souls-like experience through and through with the intense, tough-as-nails battles that fans of the genre expect. There are 3 primary weapon types in First Berserker Khazan, each with their own skill trees that give players helpful bonuses and unlock special attacks. Skill points are earned regularly enough that players shouldn't feel stuck with one particular weapon type or another, though they will find their favorite pretty quick. I enjoy using heavy weapons in Souls-likes, so I stuck with great swords most of the time, though I switched over to the faster-paced dual-wield weapons on occasion. The best offense is a good defense. First Berserker Khazan's combat is perhaps most reminiscent of Sekiro, with a heavy focus on parrying attacks. Enemies all have stamina bars that can be depleted through parries and strikes, leaving them open to a devastating blow. Certain skills make it so players can even deal damage to enemies with their parries, which makes pulling them off that much more satisfying. First Berserker Khazan's parrying window is gracious, and so even Souls-like fans that aren't big on the style should still consider giving the game a shot. First Berserker Khazan's similarities to Sekiro isn't the only way that the game has taken ideas from Software's titles. There's an obligatory poison swamp and even a boss who is clearly heavily inspired by one of Elden Ring's more memorable fights. There are certainly times when First Berserker Khazan can feel derivative of From Software's games, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. The First Berserker Khazan clearly copied From Software's homework, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The game successfully delivers a polished, exciting, action-packed Souls-like experience with all the hallmarks of the genre well accounted for. Players run the risk of losing their XP if they die and fail to return to their body. Level design has players opening shortcuts to make exploration easier. There are blade nexuses, aka bonfires, that respawn all the enemies but let players refill their netherworld energy, aka Estus Flask, and of course, there are all kinds of super difficult bosses to tackle. The First Berserker Khazan is one of those rare Souls-like games that features difficulty options, letting players choose between the default normal mode and the so-called easy mode. In typical Souls-like fashion, normal difficulty is absolutely brutal, and while easy is certainly more accessible than normal, it's no joke either. Though they will die pretty quickly if players don't keep the bosses focused on Khazan. First Berserker Khazan isn't exactly overflowing with originality, but it offers an exciting, rewarding Souls-like experience with weighty combat and challenging bosses. Fans of the genre shouldn't hesitate to pick it up, but those turned off by the high difficulty in Souls-likes hoping that easy mode would be their way and may want to try the demo first. The crevice is the hub that players visit between First Berserker Khazan's areas, accessible through any of the blade nexuses, which are the game's equivalent to Dark Souls bonfires. The crevice starts out with very little of interest, but new features are added as players progress through the main story and complete side quests. This includes the previously mentioned blacksmith, good for building rare armor sets, breaking down unneeded gear for crafting materials, and crafting consumables, as well as a merchant who sells various helpful items that can give players an edge. There's also an NPC who lets players augment their First Berserker Khazan weapons and armor so players can sacrifice something more powerful to boost their existing gear in case they have favorites they don't want to give up. It would have been nice to be able to travel directly from one blade nexus to another, but it's good to visit the crevice regularly anyway. The NPCs players collect there are important characters from the world that sometimes have interesting things to say that expand the lore, so they're worth chatting with from time to time. That being said, those looking for the deceptively deep lore of From Software's games or even a more exciting, traditionally told story are going to be disappointed with the First Berserker Khazan. The setup is that protagonist General Khazan has found himself captured and is on the brink of death, only to get possessed by a powerful ghost that gives him extra powers but has his own agenda. None of the characters are particularly fleshed out or interesting, and while there are occasionally visually striking cutscenes, First Berserker Khazan's story doesn't offer much for players to get invested in, though mileage may vary for hardcore Dungeon Fighter Online fans. Regardless, it doesn't help that there are many cutscenes that play out like motion comics instead of being fully animated. It's a shame that certain scenes are wasted on the cheap motion comic look because First Berserker Khazan's unique art style lends itself well to impressive visuals. The game blends an anime-inspired look for its characters with dark, more realistic environments. It creates a compelling contrast that makes the First Berserker Khazan a treat for the eyes, elevated by how smooth all the action is. Character designs are fairly generic anime fare, outside the creative bosses and enemies, but they still pop against the game's backgrounds. First Berserker Khazan's game design in general is generic in many ways, though it does have some unique ideas. First Berserker Khazan's summoning system is especially interesting, with players able to fight against phantoms in exchange for currency that can be used to summon and fight with a phantom during boss battles or used to upgrade the phantoms and make them more useful. The summons themselves provide a huge advantage in boss fights and are another way to make the tough battles easier. I tested both difficulties and, as someone that has earned 100% in multiple From Software games, I would say First Berserker Khazan's easy mode is still as difficult if not more difficult in some cases than any From Software title, with certain bosses serving as massive roadblocks to progress. Because of this, I would argue that First Berserker Khazan's easy mode doesn't really succeed in making the Souls-like experience all that more accessible to those who don't enjoy the extreme challenge in these kinds of games. Compared to some other Souls-likes, First Berserker Khazan does a great job of finding balance. Yes, there are certain First Berserker Khazan bosses that are extremely difficult, but they are all beatable as long as players learn their attack patterns and master when to dodge, when to parry, and when to strike. That's not to say every First Berserker Khazan boss fight is egregiously hard. Some fights in the game are relatively easy, but there are definitely battles here that will push Souls-like veterans to their limits. In any case, mastering these fights and toppling the bosses gives players an incredible sense of accomplishment. First Berserker Khazan gives players the tools to succeed. The good news is that players are given all kinds of ways to upgrade Khazan to make the boss fights a little easier. First Berserker Khazan has a rewarding loot system where players are constantly finding better gear, with greater rewards for taking down tougher foes. There are limited-use healing items that can be collected and used in tough spots when one has already burned through their netherworld energy reserves. The summon can be upgraded, points can be spent on the skill tree, and of course, Khazan's stats can be directly improved. A clever way the game staves off potential frustration is by giving players some XP for participating in the boss fights, so even if they don't win, players are still making some progress toward upgrading Khazan, which, in turn, can make the fights a little more doable. First Berserker Khazan also features side quests that can give players an edge. Certain First Berserker Khazan side quests end with significant, game-changing rewards like access to a blacksmith, and others still give players a chance to fight powerful foes and earn XP. That's all for today. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.